And so what I'm going to go over today is it's a consortium, but it really is a partnership between NOAA and USDA on promoting marine aquaculture in the United States. And the case study here is striped bass, which is sort of what I run at NC State University. And I'm going to talk to you about that project today. The coordinating institution here is North Carolina Sea Grant, in partnership then with NC State University. And so, as Dr. Eggleston had indicated, just two things I'd like to point out that are relevant to this talk. The first is that external to the university, I am involved in the NRSP8, which is the National Animal Genome Research Program. And the goal of that program is to sequence the genomes of all agriculturally relevant animals in the country. And in this, I am the National Aquaculture Coordinator. And so I am responsible for finfish and shellfish, so anything from oysters to salmon to striped bass. And I also am the National Program Coordinator for the U.S. Hybrid striped bass industry. I coordinate the breeding program for that in collaboration with U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so we distribute fish to all of the hybrid striped bass farmers in the United States. And right now that's a $50 million a year farm gate value industry, fourth largest finfish industry in the country. And so it's related to striped bass because we published this recent review talking about commercial harvest of striped bass. And back in the 1980s, there was a moratorium on the fishery. The fishery was overfished and it crashed. And this was the birth date of the U.S. hybrid striped bass industry in the 1980s, pioneered by Reggie Harrell and Ron Hodson. Ron Hodson being the former North Carolina Sea Grant Director here at NC State University. What we found, here's the hybrid striped bass production. What we have found recently, though, is the spawning stock biomass of striped bass has declined below its threshold. And so we're looking at revisiting striped bass aquaculture alongside of the sister industry of hybrid striped bass. Hybrid striped bass are raised in earthen ponds and freshwater conditions, whereas a striped bass is suitable for both freshwater and marine culture. And so it's now part of this marine aquaculture initiative for NOAA that I'm leading in the Striper Hub effort with North Carolina Sea Grant. Two other considerations are the growth rate of the different fish. So hybrid striped bass, which started in the 1980s, they grow very well up to about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds. So this is average daily weight gain. But once they reach this size, the growth rate sort of slows down. And this gray shaded bar indicates the market size of a hybrid striped bass. This is what will go to a seafood market. And so the hybrid striped bass does very well to the smaller size. However, if we want a larger fish for a better fillet dress out, the striped bass actually has sort of slower growth early on, but the growth rate really accelerates as the fish get bigger. And so the gray shaded box here indicates a target market size of a striped bass at between 3 and 5 pounds per fish, which is a better fillet market. And so we've got two different products here. One's a small fish that you can eat whole or cook whole, and one's a larger fish that you can process into a fillet. And so there's different market opportunities there, as well as the biology of the animals. Also, when we look at efficiency of growing the fish, hybrid striped bass do very well early on in their life history, but as they get bigger towards market size, their feed conversion ratio gets worse. And what feed conversion ratio is this is the amount of feed that you have to feed an animal to get weight on it. So think of it like pounds of food in to pounds of meat out. The higher the FCR, the more inefficient they are. And so hybrid striped bass, once they pass this market size, they're not very efficient growers. However, the striped bass, however, maintains a very good feed conversion ratio throughout its entire life. And so therefore, again, if we're targeting this larger market size, it's a better animal to raise for that purpose. So hybrid striped bass are good for this size market. Striped bass are great for this size market. And so in 2020, we were funded by NOAA National Sea Grant to coordinate the Striper Hub out of North Carolina State University in partnership with North Carolina Sea Grant. And these are our 4 main objectives for that program that started in 2020. The aim here is to commercialize striped bass aquaculture as a potential marine finfish alongside our hybrid striped bass industry that I'm already helping to coordinate. And our objectives are to establish this hub as a nexus to commercialize striped bass aquaculture, to demonstrate commercial level seed stock production, distribution, grow out, and production economics, to develop marketing strategies, market economics, permitting clarity, and business models for farmers, and also then to establish communication, outreach, extension, and training networks to support this industry as it grows. And this includes workforce training, as well as then informing policymakers on regulatory concerns for striped bass, which I'll talk about when we get to that section. And so the presentation will be organized based upon these segments. And it's wanting me to admit some. All right. So this map here sort of shows our partner institutions in this program, again, led by North Carolina Sea Grant and NC State University, but also in partnership with University of Maryland, Cornell, University of New Hampshire, and then our colleagues here at USDA ARS in Stuttgart, Arkansas, at the National Research Lab for Hybrid Striped Bass. We also work with community colleges for workforce development, so Carteret Community College, Brunswick Community College. We employ the state extension service in this for North Carolina, and also we involve sea grant agencies from New Hampshire, New York, and Maryland, again, coordinated by North Carolina. So it's a East Coast scale project. This is sort of a flow chart there of our current team as of the what I would say the flagship team upon the funding of the project. However, we've grown, we've added members to this team, but really it's organized so that we can look at the phases of production. So growth and production, either in the Southeast or the Northeast regions. We also look at important aspects of the industry. And so these are all experts that are advising us on harvesting, marketing and processing, feeds and nutrition, business economics, workforce training, coordinating breeding and hatchery activities, along with seed stock distributions, and then also our communications and outreach team. And so we've grown this group a little bit. So this is sort of a dated slide, but this is the core group when we were funded initially. One of the first things we did was try to identify ourselves, and we designed several different logos. And what we did was we participated in the 8th annual NC Catch Summit with local seafood at the Transfer Hall in Raleigh. Also participating here was NC Division of Marine Fisheries, Sea Grant, and NC Department of Ag and Consumer Services. And we had our stakeholders vote on which logo was the best, as well as informing them on this new project. This was right before the pandemic hit on March 2nd, 2020. We identified this logo as the one that we were going to go with. The stakeholders like that the best. And so we liked the logo so much, we actually made T-shirts. This is one of our teams that, at the 35th annual NC Seafood Festival, Morehead City in 2021. I'll talk more about our outreach event there, but we did create shirts for this, and we use them then when we do our outreach activities. So this was one of the ones we did last October. You can see Ken Riley here from NOAA, along with then Eric Herbst and Frank Lopez and Barry Nash from NC Sea Grant, Russell Borski, myself from the university, and my graduate student Linnea Anderson. And in this particular case, Caroline Dominguez was a chef who prepared striped bass for the public there, and we talked about it. I also participate in the North Carolina Aquaculture Development Conference in New Bern, North Carolina. Here we are sitting up front here, again, right before the pandemic. These are our USDA colleagues from Arkansas. But we do Striper Hub seminars there. We talk about striped bass aquaculture, and we also do workshops where we help train farmers and explain to them about aquaculture and how to grow striped bass. And so in person, we did an event in 2020. We held a virtual event last year. We're planning to be in person again this year in March. And so we do that in collaboration with Farm Bureau and other agencies. So we've established this hub. We've organized it. We've got people involved. And so the next phase then was to actually show that we can do this. And so I mentioned that I'm the coordinator of the U.S. Hybrid Striped Bass Breeding Program. And this is at the Pamlico Aquaculture Field Laboratory in Aurora, North Carolina. So about 2.5 hours away in eastern North Carolina. All of our hybrid striped bass farmers in the state are primarily located in Beaufort, Craven, and Hyde counties surrounding this facility. So we've got a very good interface there with our farmers and stakeholders on the hybrid striped bass side of things. And what we raised here are what we call domesticated striped bass and domesticated white bass. Typically, we've been providing these to farmers to produce hybrid crosses on their farms for the hybrid industry. However, nothing stops us from using the domesticated striped bass for what we call pure strain domesticated striped bass industry. And so what we've been doing now is distributing broodstock animals as well as larvae and fingerlings from this facility to grow out operations in the state of North Carolina. And I always tell people, if you want to know more about what we're doing, we do host field trips and workshops here. So come down and see us in Aurora, North Carolina, April to May, when we're spawning the striped bass. I reside at this facility pretty much from the 15th of April to the 15th of May. And anyone interested in getting striped bass, please contact the superintendent out there, Michael Hopper, for our what we call fish orders. One of the strengths of striped bass is that we do have this domesticated fish. A lot of other aquaculture industries in the country do not have domesticated animals to grow. Oftentimes the broodstock are obtained from the wild. And some of our content or information was featured in this editorial in Science Magazine back in 2020 that discusses the importance of having domesticated animals with genetic improvement for aquaculture, because aquaculture is agriculture. You know, all the other food animals we eat, pigs, chickens, and cows, are domesticated. And so the idea here is that the seafood needs to move in this direction as well. So this was an editorial that sort of discussed some aspects of the strengths of having domestication in aquaculture, and I sort of helped provide insight into that editorial. And to give you an actual idea of how powerful it is, this figure this figure shows these F3 to F7 generation fish. So if we go back to let's see here, the early 2000s, when I first came to NC State University to study for my PhD, we have these F3 fish from 2004 to 2007. The domesticated striped bass there had a growth chart or a growth record of this. So at age 1, 2, 3, and 4 years of age, this was the size of those fish. Now, if we did one generation of selective breeding on that, we get an F4, and we select these fish for superior growth. And then we do the same thing for F5 and for F6. You can see the growth performance jumps dramatically for each one of those generations of selective breeding, just by picking the largest animals and breeding them on themselves. And so what we're seeing here is an average of anywhere from 10 to 20% improvement in growth performance based using just traditional breeding. This is nothing fancy. There's no markers or selected. There's no GMO, anything. This is literally just picking the biggest fish and crossing them with each other. And the F7 line here is dashed because we literally just made those for the first time a year or two ago. And so I've got the average growth performance of those first F7 fish as of last year when they were age 1. And again, we can see the F7 fish are about 25% better in growth performance compared to even the F6s, which were considered very good. And so this tells you the power there of domestication, selective breeding. We've also sequenced the white bass and striped bass genomes in collaboration with USDA. My graduate student, Linnea Anderson, this is part of her dissertation project, but Abernathy is at USDA ARS. He's in charge of the white bass genome. Linnea is in charge of the striped bass genome. And right now the striped bass genome is posted. It's available on NCBI. It's fully annotated. So it's a very valuable resource tool for doing research on striped bass. We also recently completed the most comprehensive population genetic study of striped bass along the east coast of the United States in collaboration with researchers in Canada and also federal agencies in the United States. And we used dd-RADseq, genome resequencing, to do a population genetic evaluation there. So we also do work with wild striped bass as well as our farm-raised domestic fish. And finally, as far as a breeding program, I always like to give a shout out to Jeff Evans at Wildlife Resources Commission. We provide domesticated white bass males to the Watha hatchery, and Jeff then uses those to produce hybrid striped bass, which are then stocked into all the freshwater reservoirs in the state of North Carolina for the Dingle Johnson Sport Fish Restoration Fund. So we also support recreational fisheries as well. My student Linnea published these two papers here last year. This was the first demonstration of spawning striped bass without using any hormones. You know, this was going back to Monk's Corner in South Carolina. Everyone was using human chorionic gonadotropin as a hormone to induce spawning in striped bass for decades. And we developed a method where we can spawn these fish now in captivity with hormone-free methods, what we call batch spawning, this paper down here. And this research was featured then in the spring 2021 issue of Coast Watch. It sort of tells a story about how we figured this out. it was really serendipity. We sort of figured it out accidentally. And so the title of the article here, Magic at 64.4 degrees, that is the spawning temperature of striped bass in Fahrenheit. It's 18 degrees centigrade, and we found that by manipulating the temperature and the photo period, we could get this fish to spawn in the tanks without using chemicals. And so it's a very interesting read if you've got time for that. And again, that was research we conducted down at our Pamlico field lab facility. And to give you an idea of the commercial scale here, our hatchery can hold 20 million striped bass eggs at a time, and we can process about 5 million larvae at a time after they hatch. And so the process that we published, this batch spawning process, is commercially scalable in enough to provide seed stock then to an entire industry, which is what we're trying to do. We're also looking at intensive larval rearing of striped bass in tanks with USDA and Mike Frinsko at NC Extension, looking at things like swim bladder inflation rate and nutritional requirements so that we can avoid things like deformities in the fingerlings. A lot of times you see this scoliosis that's either due to improperly inflated swim bladder or some kind of nutritional deficiency. And so we're looking at how to best raise striped bass at the larval to fingerling stage in tanks. Right now, we do it in ponds using extensive culture based on the protocols that are already established for hybrid striped bass industry. We're also looking at culturing striped bass at different systems, freshwater recirculating enclosed tanks, flow through aquaculture tanks at our Pamlico field site, also in seawater recirculating aquaculture tanks in simulated cage culture, and then a combination of pond and recirculating where we can grow a fish out for the first year, for the first phase of the production cycle in ponds, and then transfer them into tanks for the final grow out. So combinatorial culture methods. And I'll talk a little bit about each one of those. And just to give you an idea here, this is a growth curve of domesticated striped bass in a recirculating aquaculture system at freshwater. So less than 5 parts per thousand, somewhere between 20 to 23 degrees ambient temperature. And we can take a 60-gram fish up to about 3 pounds in 350 days, which is pretty good. Current hybrid striped bass industry, the market cycle is about 16 to 18 months to get to market size. And so we're very competitive with that. And again, these are in enclosed tanks inside of buildings. When we look at our outdoor flow-through pools, we have to deal with ambient temperature. So in the wintertime, it's cold and they don't grow so well. In the summertime, it's really hot. They don't like that either. So their growth rate's a little bit slower, but each of these blue diamonds represents a replicate grow-out tank. These grow-out tanks are 10,000 gallons each, so commercial scale. And we can see this is their growth curve here. We can see that we can get a little bit of a lagger. We're trying to get a 3-pound fish by, say, like 24 months, but looks like it takes a few extra months to get to that 3 pounds bottom end of the market scale. And so outdoors, because we have to deal with temperature, the fish grow a little bit slower, but they do very well, even in outdoor tanks. And so these were using the F6 generation fish. So we expect to have a little bit better growth performance using our F7s. When we talk about simulated cage culture, this was work done up at University of New Hampshire with David Berlinski. Donna Lanzetta, pictured here, owns Mana Fish Farms, and she's actually got permits out right now for cage culture for striped bass in New England area, so New York. She's also got permits filed with NOAA for Gulf of Mexico. So she wants to grow striped bass in offshore cages. And right now, we're not permitted to do that, but the next best thing to do then is to grow the fish in simulated net pen cages. And what that means is we grew them in tanks where we control the photo period and temperature. And so David collected the water temperature data from NOAA buoys offshore, located in areas close to where these close to where these cage culture operations would be. And then the fish were raised in these tanks with these manipulated photothermal cycles, both light and temperature. And also, because of escapement concerns, we realized that domesticated striped bass is probably not the best candidate for offshore culture. And so we're probably going to be using something that's sourced more from the wild, or at least sourced closer to the geographic region where the cage culture operations would be. And so we tested fish, the broodstock that were obtained from the waters of offshore of Delaware, Virginia, Maryland. We took those fish and spawned them and then raised their offspring in this study. So these are what we call wild origin, or maybe F0 first generation captive fish. And we grew them in these simulated culture conditions and found that the Delaware and Virginia fish did very well in the culture conditions. Maryland fish not so well. So for instance, when we go back to suggesting what kind of broodstock we should start with for offshore culture, we're going to suggest something like fish obtained from Delaware or Virginia waters. And so this is work done up at the University of New Hampshire. Some of the metrics or outputs from our program so far, again, considering it started in 2020, this shows here our fish distributions from our Pamlico Field Lab facility. And so since the beginning of this project, we have disseminated over 10 million larval fish to producers and researchers in the eastern part of the United States. We have over 500,000 striped bass fingerlings that have been grown out on farms or are currently being grown out on farms. And we've already harvested now 48,000 pounds of fish that have gone into commercial markets. The grow out cycle for these fish is about 24 months. And so really this year is when we're really going to start seeing our production numbers increase, because a lot of these fish were distributed in 2020. And so this is now 2 years later. And so we're going to start seeing a lot more of these fish here that went out. For instance, these 150,000 fish that went out in 2020, they're going to be market size now in 2022. And so we're going to hopefully see this number go up quite a bit. We also work with local seafood, Ryan Speckman, Lynn Peterson out of Raleigh, North Carolina. We look at things like dress out weight, processing of the fish, and market distributions. And so here we are harvesting some fish from our Pamlico site on an ice chest that then go into Raleigh to be processed and at their facility here to be distributed to seafood markets and restaurants throughout the state. And we're looking at things like what's the best way to process the fish, how should you slaughter them, how should you store and transport them. And so one of the things we were looking at is how they do it in the salmon industry is they cut the isthmus of the fish and let them bleed out on an ice slurry and then transfer them into fresh ice. And they are then stored that way until they're processed. So cutting the isthmus and bleeding them out on an ice slurry is one of the things we looked at, as well as, and so here's another photo of that, us harvesting those fish in our grow out tanks. This is an example here of when I say enclosed recirculating aquaculture. These tanks are inside of a building and we can control the temperature and the lights. The fish are grown in these tanks then, and when at harvest, we'll then net the fish out, cut the isthmus like this, and again, then bleed the fish out onto an ice slurry. And that preserves the flesh and really enhances the shelf life of the fish. When we harvest our fish at our commercial sites or at our Pamlico field site, you know, these photos here were taken one morning when we were harvested 10,000 pounds at once. So we're talking about a lot of fish at one time. And so we use larger equipment like forklifts with ice chests. And again, we're hauling fish with 18-wheel trucks. And so, for instance, one of these ice totes here can hold 3,000 pounds of striped bass. And what we do is we net those fish out and then put them on this super chilled ice slurry that includes ice, water, and salt. And so that chill kills the fish. And so some of the distributors want them to be bled, other ones want them chill killed. It sort of it sort of varies by the seafood markets that we're dealing with. And so one of the ones we've developed here over the last 2 years is this sort of supply chain using local seafood to distribute locally into the North Carolina state. Again, this is part of the whole Gotta Be NC the logo with the commissioner's office. And so this is for local distributions into the state. When we go out of state or nationwide, we've got Nixon Fishery and LD Amory up in Hampton, Virginia. So these are what our current supply chains look like for ourselves, and then that we pioneered, and also then this is the information we share them with our farmers. Just to give you an idea, this is just a snapshot of 78 locations, including restaurants and seafood markets, where you can get farm-raised striped bass now simply through local seafood. And it includes Death and Taxes and Pools in Raleigh, which again are Ashley Christensen's restaurants. So in some cases, there's pretty high profile venues. So we are pioneering now getting the farm-raised fish out and establishing a market for them. We're also working with Matt Parker at University of Maryland. He's at Maryland Sea Grant. This is a manual that he wrote years ago. Matt was in North Carolina. He wrote this manual for the NC Department of Ag and Consumer Services for economics of hybrid striped bass aquaculture, that this was a downloadable PDF that was available to farmers. We're going to revamp this manual with a focus on striped bass. And so again, this is going to be a resource or a tool for farmers in the state who want to raise striped bass, and they can look then at the economic inputs, outputs, and things like that, as well as looking at farm gate value and operational costs. And so we're working on economics and business models, including enterprise budgets. And again, those are outreach materials for farmers. So our objective 3 here was to develop marketing strategies. And we talked about getting fish into markets. Part of the reason why we're going to get fish into the markets, like restaurants and seafood distribution sites, is so that the farmers then can follow up behind us. And so this is some information here from Pacifico in Mexico. They're the only other commercial striped bass farm in the world, and they're in Ensenada, Mexico. And they, for instance, have got the nutrition values and facts about striped bass that they've published. We market we send our fish to local seafood as Wolfpack Striper for NC State University. So if you see Wolfpack Striper, that's the Striper Hub domestic striped bass. These numbers are a little bit old. $18 a pound was maybe a couple of years ago. Now, local seafood this year and end of last year, it's closer to $21 a pound for a boneless skin on fillet. Whole fish are somewhere between $8 and $10 a pound if they're gutted and scaled. So if you see them in the market, that's sort of what the price points are. And I started off by talking about our logo in our t-shirts. And so we did this event here, the 35th annual NC Seafood Festival in Morehead City. And we did this with North Carolina Sea Grant. Here's our chef, Carolyn, cooking striped bass. So what we did was we provided striped bass to the event. We cooked it. The chef, Carolyn, explained how to cook it. She talked about the recipe. And then at the end, everyone was served the striped bass. So I think we had 100 or 200 pounds of striped bass we gave out. And so the recipe here was sauteed garlic, basil butter striped bass. One of our farmers, Aubrey, only came out and discussed, he talked to the audience as to how the fish are raised, where his farm is at, typical traceability kind of information. And so people then could see who made the fish. The chef talked about how to make it. And then I was there. Alexis Cruz from Fox Eastern Carolina moderated a question and answer session. So I entertained questions there from the public as well. Where the fish come from, how we raise them, things like that. And so it was a really good outreach event. Barry Nash then showed up, and when we distributed the fish, we gave out surveys for sensory panel. We had all the participants rate the quality of the seafood product, by taste and other sensory characteristics. So Barry then came out and talked about that. What we found is that the consumers there, very favorable reviews on the striped bass. These are some of the portions that we were serving. Several people came up and got seconds or thirds, but really we found that most people rated it as a 5 or a 6, very good. And we answered a lot of questions on the whole wild caught versus farm raised, which the audience was very interested in. And as you can see, that the farm raised aspect of it did not influence their evaluation of the quality of the product. It was very well received. In addition to this, we've also developed recipes. So Barry Nash, if you go to the Sea Grant Mariners menu, there's a lot of new striped bass recipes on there now, because one of the things we're doing is providing striped bass to people for free if they're willing to design or develop recipes for us. So Joyce Taylor and Vanna Lewis with Barry, we featured a lot on there. This was one of them, the sauteed garlic basil butter striped bass that was used in our sensory panel. This is one of the ones that's on there. And so we're trying to put together a small recipe book as well. Right now, we've got probably at least a couple dozen total recipes. We're also working with NC State Extension Homegrown Series. This is a recipe here, ginger crusted bass over vinegar rice. This is a video presentation on YouTube that was filmed at the Dinah Gore Kitchen on main campus. And so this is another outreach where we look at how to prepare seafood as a public outreach kind of information. Altogether, these numbers are a little bit old. I think we've got 24 recipes now, but us at the university, along with Sea Grant, have built several recipes, and now we're going to potentially look at reaching out to Vivian Howard and Ashley Christensen as well, considering that some of our fish are already at Ashley Christensen's restaurants in Raleigh. We also work with the National Sea Grant Law Center to look at regulatory and permitting concerns with striped bass. And so a lot of people don't realize that it's illegal to be in possession of a striped bass in New Jersey or New Hampshire. You cannot sell it in a market. And so that's not even just catching the fish. That's like going to a grocery store. And so we're looking at identifying state laws and statutes so we can identify those that might need to be changed. And so we came up with this TLP protocol, traffic light protocol, for information to send out to our stakeholders. So for instance, if you're looking at marketing these fish, there are considerations here as well as in the yellow area where there might be special permitting. In particular, along the eastern Atlantic coast states, gill tags, for instance, on the striped bass. Whereas when you go further inland, these considerations are not present, right? You don't need to worry about these. And so we're working with the Sea Grant Law Office to sort of identify this as an informational handout, again, outreach or extension. So for example, this is information we put together for the state of Virginia. We're looking at regulatory provisions for each of the states, in particular those along the Atlantic, for both the culture production as well as then the marketing. So there are considerations there on both being in possession and growing as well as then selling. And so we're trying to put together an information booklet there. And for instance, even with references then to the specific statutes of each of the states. One of the ones that we recently was engaged in was with Farm Bureau, NC Department of Ag and Consumer Services, the North Carolina Aquaculture Association, and the NC Division of Marine Fisheries upon the gill tagging of striped bass in the state of North Carolina. And so these are gill tags that typically when a commercial fisherman harvests a striped bass, they have to tag it with one of these plastic tags for the gills. Now, this is fine if you're harvesting 3 or 4 fish a day, but I just sort of said on a single morning, we might harvest 10,000 pounds. You're looking at thousands of tags. And so what we did was we entered into a discussion here as to what the best way to deal with this was. And the output of that was in January 14th of this year, the DMF released a proclamation on finfish aquaculture operations exemptions, which exempted farmers in the state from having to tag their fish with the gill tag. So what we do is, in place of that, is we have all the accurate paperwork that goes with those fish, including a letter from myself indicating that these are USDA produced fish, and also the aquaculture operations permits paperwork to show that they were raised on a farm and the permit number of that producer. So we found a way to solve this with a paperwork trail, which also helps us with our seafood traceability efforts, right? A lot of consumers these days want to know where their fish are coming from anyhow. And so this is information we already want to collect. And it's great that we're able to also help out Marine Patrol and DMF if they're trying to look at things like poaching. We've provided, assembled a database here of the different commercial gear types that are used to harvest striped bass commercially in the different coastal states, as well as then the availability of striped bass in seafood markets from the wild harvest. So for instance, peak availability is right around now until say the end of April. And then once the spawning season ends, there's sort of not a lot of fish available in the markets. So when we talk to our farmers, we say the optimal time to sell the farm-raised fish is right now when we're not in competition with commercial fishermen. That way we can sort of all share the market. The commercial fishermen can sell their fish here. We're farmers, we can sell them here when the commercial fishermen aren't able to bring the striped bass to market. So that way we have also year-round availability of striped bass in seafood markets. And so this is all the other information that we provide then to our stakeholders. And so the last aspect here is to establish communications, outreach, extension, and training kinds of things to support our industry. We engage in tours and workshops. So Chris Chambers from NOAA came, for instance, to visit us with Donna Lanzetta here at our fish barn facility, where we also raise striped bass in Raleigh, North Carolina, at the Lake Wheeler Field Laboratory. And so we do tours, we show people how we're growing the fish, we talk to them about it. This is an article we were featured in Raleigh Magazine about when we first started really distributing our fish in 2019 to restaurants with local seafood, showcasing the availability of these fish in restaurants in downtown Raleigh. Also at the Locals Oyster Bar, which is owned by Local Seafood. It's their restaurant. And like I said, Sea Grant is developing recipes for Mariner's Menu, but we're also developing recipes here at North Carolina State University. And this is with Carolyn Dunn and Ben Chapman in the Department of Agriculture and Human Services. Derek, a day before he left to go to VIMS, he and I had come up with this idea with Carolyn and Ben about Hot Eats Cool Science, where we had outreach events where we would serve striped bass. We would show people how to cook striped bass, and we would serve them the striped bass as a dinner. And then while they were serving it, Ben Chapman would talk about seafood safety, and I would talk about aquaculture and fish farming. And we would inform the people about where their food came from while they were eating. And so these are hot eats cool science events. And so anyone who's interested in more information on these, please contact Michelle Jewell. As our COVID restrictions are beginning to be lifted, we'd like to engage in these again. In some cases, these were small dinner parties, maybe like 2 or 3 dozen people, but in some cases they were relatively large. Our advertisements for Hot Eats Cool Science always come with a recipe on the back, and that's the featured recipe that we'll be discussing for that night. So this one here is Thai bass fish cakes. And so we would talk then about how to prepare these things, and everyone would eat them. And the largest event we did was for over 300 persons at Carter Finley Stadium, where we had people come through and do taste samples. Those were like groups of 50 at a time. So this one here was the fish cakes with kimchi. And then we talked about striped bass aquaculture, sustainability initiatives, and things like this for seafood. So really good outreach events that we were doing. We also work with David Serino at Carteret Community College. This is an outreach event he does, Shuck, Rattle, and Roll. I think a lot of people here at Seamaster are aware of this one. If you ever get served a striped bass out there, those are fish that we send to David, and then David's students in his program raise those fish to market size, and when they're ready to be harvested, he then uses them for this event. So we give them the fish so that he can use the fish to train his students, as well as then do outreach events on its own. So these are the number of students that we've helped of the last, say, 3 years with the Striper Hub and with fish, with striped bass from our group. Also with the pandemic, we've had to become creative. We'd like to do in-person events, but that's not possible all the time. So we did things like a striped bass dissection Q&A with K through 12 students in classrooms, where we walked through striped bass dissection, showed them how to do it, and answered questions. And Michelle Jewell was a moderator for this. We did that last February, again, with grade school age kids. Also, Carolina Biological Supply Company has switched their yellow perch bismount specimen to now it is a hybrid striped bass. We helped them come up with the dissection guide for this. So again, as a teaching aid for K through 12 classrooms, they're now using hybrid striped bass as opposed to yellow perch. And we helped them come up with that guide. And we also do various other extensions. This is an example out of New Hampshire Sea Grant. These 4 or 5 minute long videos where we talk about our research and how to culture striped bass. And so this is Dr. Linus Kenter at New Hampshire Sea Grant as a video showing his research up there at New Hampshire and how we grow the fish. Mike Frisco at NC Cooperative Extension, along with Pete Anderson at NC Department of Ag and Consumer Services, had this little bit on Spectrum News 1 last year, talking about aquaculture in the booming industry in North Carolina. And then WRAL, NBC, and Farm Bureau came up with this documentary, Fish Farms, last year as well, showcasing the aquaculture potential and opportunities in the state of North Carolina. And so we had help with lending to those efforts as well. And towards the end here, I'd like to wrap it up by saying that we featured in a lot of popular press articles. Here's an article here from Aquaculture North America from October of last year. Pure strain striped bass, an opportunity waiting to be tapped. And a quote from the article says, "The market opportunity for striped bass exists, is strongly and largely untapped, and it is for the taking. And that is why we are here." We are planning to take advantage of this opportunity, and that is what Striper Hub is doing. And so with that, I'd like to just sort of wrap it up by saying I do a lot of advising. I'm a subject matter expert for both NOAA and USDA. And over the last several years, I have been part of this, what we call Marine Aquaculture Initiative, but really bringing NOAA and USDA together to tackle issues like seafood and seafood supply and also sustainability. And so I've spoken in Washington, D.C. on more than one occasion. I've given input and advice on things like this executive order on promoting seafood competitiveness. And last year, I was also invited as an advisor for U.S. Department of Homeland Security on food supply systems. I always like to say the United States, despite its economic prowess, imports the vast majority of its seafood. And so this is a concern of the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the food supply resilience. But also it's a concern of NOAA and the Department of Commerce in the fact that it's a $16 billion a year seafood trade deficit. In the fact in fact, when we go to Homeland Security, this has now been elevated to the level of national security because it's part of this whole supply chain issue. When we're outsourcing seafood, that's a national security concern. And so when I was part of this panel, we came up with this. I'm one of the principal authors on this report, Threats to Food and Agricultural Resources. And after interviewing many experts across the country, one of the conclusions of this panel is the United States really needs to increase its domestic seafood production, so it's no longer reliant on foreign importation. And so with that, I'd like to just maybe have a couple other things. I think I've got a minute or two that I went over our Striper Hub initiatives and also our aquaculture initiatives, but we also do a lot of other projects related to striped bass. And so, for instance, I'm an author on this paper here, measuring PFAS levels of striped bass in the Cape Fear River. The outgroup for this paper was our farm-raised striped bass, which of course had trace amounts of PFAS in them compared to fish that were captured from the Cape Fear River. And this was with Scott Belcher. This was the NIHS paper of the month in 2020 and also featured in National Geographic in 2020, talking about the persistence of PFAS compounds in the Cape Fear River. We also work with other groups outside of the state, like the Pennsylvania Striped Bass Association. We helped advise them to design and construct a hatchery building so that they could actually spawn striped bass up at Raystown Lake, that they could stock into the lake to support their recreational fisheries. And they come down and they take tours of our facilities and see what we're doing. And they recently won an award from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for their work there in maintaining the striped bass in that reservoir. And again, there's lots of different partners on this. I'd like to just say thank you again to USDA, NOAA, FFAR, the university, and many other nonprofit and private sector partners. This is a very large project that involves a lot of moving parts, as well as persons at agencies such as Mike Denson in South Carolina, and of course then Steve Troxler's office and the Division of Marine Fisheries. And these are some of our students and collaborators. And I'd like to just end by saying, Ron Hodson sort of started hybrid striped bass in North Carolina in 1986. And this was a photo of Ron and Russell and I. Russell and I are two PIs on the Striper Hub project. And Ron is still around. He still is involved. We still get his input. We still give him updates. So he's very happy, and he likes to see what we're doing and where we're going. And so Ron Hodson's still involved as well. So again, all this very close work with North Carolina Sea Grant currently and also historic. So with that, I'll end with this slide here of my two children and I fertilizing striped bass ponds out at the Pamlico Field Lab. I love this slide. My kids enjoy going out there and seeing what we do. And that is all I have for today, for now. And I'll be glad to entertain any questions as time permits. And also then I'll be glad to stay on and answer any kind of specific technical research questions, things like that. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Benjamin. So a round of applause for our speaker. That was fascinating. I mean, it was such a comprehensive overview, biology, management, the technical aspects of aquaculture, the marketing, branding, economics. So anyways, a lot to peel back from your presentation. So I'm sure we have some questions. So we've got probably about 10 minutes for questions. So open up the floor to our audience.
Hi, yeah. I do have a super quick question about these huge management and research projects that are involved and span over several years. The teams that you develop, how do you determine how many people are kind of on this team, or is it just like more the merrier, or is it really like you need to determine a certain set group that's liminal to what kind of project you're working on?
That's a good point there, Ben. I would say that there is a consideration. I look at it in a couple different ways. The first is there is a critical mass consideration, and the critical mass is what is the minimum number that you need to tackle a big issue like this. So, for instance, I'm only one person, so I can't do every aspect of it, and so I know that I will have to get an expert in there to sort of head up some of these different areas. So for instance, I don't know anything about fish feed or nutrition, for instance. I know I need at least one person there's a fine point though between going from that core critical mass of like say 1 or 2 dozen people to like hundreds where you end up having to, as I like to call it, herding cats. You can't herd the cats if you get too many people in the room. So what I like to do is sketch out what the scope of the project is at the beginning. And like that, the slide I had shown there with the core personnels, those focus areas, I start off with something like that. Then once I have that, then I go, all right, who are the best people then that I should contact to then potentially plug into those positions? And then upon doing so, I might ask them for their advice then on who else might be eligible. And so you sort of grow it from there. Is sort of how I do it. So I look at a core outline and then build from it, as opposed to just putting out a free for all call. A lot of times you get a lot of noise, or in some cases you can get important information there, but you have to be sort of selective. And then once you grow, the other thing is it's not like an end all be all. And so when you're starting something out, it's a different phase than if you've already got something implemented, right? So if you've already got the ball rolling, it's a lot easier for you to get more people on board as you go. And so that's why I say the core people we have are what I showed on the slide, but now we've got probably at least a dozen or 2 more on there that are also helping. And so I think that I wouldn't limit yourself to saying, nope, this is our team, we're only taking this many applications. You sort of have to be flexible. But I would say, yeah, definitely start off by outlining and planning your actual scope of the project first. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was it's kind of like you want to start somewhere and know where you want to bring your team, but as more people come in, you don't want to shut it out. You want to be able to kind of grow yourself and maybe pass a certain critical mass.
Exactly. And you do want to, at that point, you do want to have like what I'd call the key visionaries of the team. So it's like you and like maybe a handful of other people sort of draft out this vision, and then you find people to put into it. And you can always change it. You know, like I always tell my students, even when I write a paper, I write probably a dozen different titles for that paper, and they change all the time until you submit it. And so the same thing goes with this. When I come up with the vision, it's often something I like to pencil down with a handful of key people. And then it's subject to change based upon input after you start talking to people, but you sort of want to have some direction. Otherwise it becomes, I would say, unwieldy is the word.
Gotcha. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Benjamin, we've got a question from Mary Watson, and then John White has a question in the chat.
Excellent. Yes, Mary.
Well, my question is very similar to the one that John White posted in the chat. You're doing really comprehensive work, which is really interesting, and I applaud you for all of that. One thing you didn't really say much about was the water quality implications of raising fish in ponds and watersheds that are struggling with non-point source pollution, or even the even bigger issue of raising fish in pens in the coastal ocean, and what the water quality impacts might be. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I can, Mary. Those are good questions. And you know, to begin with, on the onshore systems, and so this is one of the things that there's been great headway being made with aquaculture, in the sense that you have now multi-trophic or integrated trophic culture systems, whereby aquaculture has come to the point now where there are a handful of operations still in the state, like for instance, the trout operations that will have discharge into the bodies of water. But people have now realized that fish waste is actually valuable. Mm-hmm. And so you're looking at now a lot more like serious considerations of things like aquaponics and hydroponics. And so when you look at like a lot of these culture systems, there's a potential there to do a multi-trophic culture where you have plants or other organisms like filter feeding shellfish, for instance, removing the waste from the water. And the fact that I was just on the phone earlier today with a guy at one of the major aquaponics companies, and he was saying that, you know how many how many millions and millions of dollars row crop farmers pay for nitrogen-based fertilizers to put on their crops, where when we look at our fish waste, the primary excretion product is ammonia. It's not urea, it's ammonia, and that's converted by nitrosomonas and nitrobacter into nitrate, which is plug and play right into a plant. So it's not even like they have to modify the constituency of that fertilizer. I think that as the technologies advance, we're going to have more of that going on, where discharge isn't going to be necessarily a problem, because as usual, if you put $1 of value to something, people are not going to be discharging it; they'll be selling it. Same with the solid waste as an earth enhancer. When it comes to to follow up, we've got Jim Holland's got a postdoc out at our Lake Wheeler site right now, where he's using our fish waste as biofloc to grow duckweed, for instance, which is, can be harvested and then dried. It's got a very high protein content, so it's a very good feed supplement. There's that, along with lettuces and all sorts of other things you can use that are already commercially being done. So I think that that is going to is being addressed right now. When it comes to the offshore stuff, that's sort of a conundrum. I know, for instance, the guys at Pacifico, what they do with their net pens, they're down in Ensenada. Underneath their net pens, they have shellfish. And so they actually have what you call like a second crop down there. And the filter feeders actually they use to help clean the water. They're also one of the only companies in the world that has 4-star certified BMP from all the major groups in the world that certify aquaculture practices. So they're very conscientious and minded about sustainability and environmental stewardship. And I think that in America, the offshore cages is, there's a reason why we sort of did our simulated cage culture to sort of set up the potential for that. But the majority of our efforts have been dedicated to pond-based culture or recirculating aquaculture, because there are a lot of loopholes of permitting and regulatory concerns that we're going to have to address before I think that becomes an outright, what I'd say, commercially feasible. Because right now, the thing about government is this: when you've got someone who's got many millions of dollars burning a hole in their pocket and they want to invest it in an enterprise, the last thing they want to see is uncertainty on behalf of the government. And so when they cannot guarantee what is going to happen or not happen with a permit, for instance, as simple as a permit might be, that's a complete red flag. Those people are going to say, I'm going to take my money and go to the stock market. I'm not going to try to do any kind of fish farming if we have an issue there, because they don't want to risk that investment. So I've had many conversations with Noah about this, and a lot of those stakeholder groups that we've conducted included a lot of these same people. And I'm, for instance, even quoting them, and that's exactly what they've said to Noah. And so I think it is a consideration. And so shellfish right now would be one consideration for the cages, but there's a lot of other ones too. It has to do with the use of the coastal property as well. People who want to see a fish farm out there and things like that.
Yeah, I really wanted you to talk about the integrated systems angle of things that people are looking at. It. Some really creative and awesome work happening at moving towards sustainability for the students to hear that and know that there's a solution there. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. And to add to that, when I was in Uganda, we were doing some project out there with African lungfish culture. And those things are carnivorous. And so you have to feed them a high protein diet. And to give you an idea of one of the multi-trophic systems we were working on out there, tilapia are a good fish. But the problem with them is there's a lot of unwanted natural reproduction. Those things reach sexual maturity at a very, very young age. And so they oftentimes they'll be reproducing in the tanks before harvest. And so one of the considerations there is to make monosex populations. Well, we're here in Africa, there's not a whole lot of technology there, let alone a feed mill, for instance, to even make feed for the lungfish. So what we said is, why don't you polyculture the tilapia with the lungfish? So whenever the tilapia reproduce, the lungfish then would eat the juvenile tilapia. And then they would also then grow water hyacinth on top of the surface of the water as a way then to absorb all the nitrogen waste. And so it was a three trophic level culture system it was integrated, where you could deal with feeding the animals as well as then dealing with the food waste. And so those are the kinds of things that we're doing, for instance, in USAID. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in there, Mary, that I think that we're going to see a lot of advancements here in the next 10 years that are going to be very, very cool.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks, Benjamin. Looks like we're out of time. Reese, I'm hoping you can stay on and ask Benjamin your question when we reconvene in 5 minutes. But before we finish, John White, did Benjamin answer your question? Did you want to chime in and see if he wants to take it in a slightly different direction to answer your question?
Oh, I didn't even, yeah, sorry. How big an issue might be when, how big an issue might be, say, when drought influences low stream flow and watershed? We captured, okay, because a lot of times, most of our water is well water or and that kind of thing. And so, you know, again, with the water flow issue, that's more of that's definitely an issue more for trout, less so for enclosed recirculating systems, and less so for our pond-based systems, because we're using, if we do fill those ponds, it's usually rainwater and or well water.
Great. Well, with that, I'd like to give Benjamin a round of applause. Great presentation. Thanks so much for your time.